Хотел представить следующего спикера, Николаса Камерона. Он наш и спикер, и гость, является партнером и руководителем отдела форензик на Ближнем Востоке, KPMG Lower Gulf. Nicholas, thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And unfortunately, my Uzbek is quite poor. So
No problem.
if you permit me, I'll present in English, but I think there's some translation available. But it's a pleasure to be invited, and it's a pleasure to be in Uzbekistan, especially considering the growing importance of the commercial and trade ties between the Middle East and Central Asia. I think there's also some similarities between the UAE and the lower Gulf regions of the Middle East and Uzbekistan, based on the vision of both of our governments to really drive forward digitalisation as a driver of growth for our economies as we move forward. And therefore we thought there might be some similarities also in some of the challenges that we've faced across the Middle East, some of the unique ones over the past couple of years. What you may face here or what you already may be facing, and some of the lessons learned that perhaps we can share. And as KPMG, we're very committed to both the +Forum, but also the channel between the two regions. So firstly, I'd say the context of where this comes from perhaps is the Middle East has been going through a bit of a golden period at the moment. The diversification away from oil and hydrocarbons as the primary driver of economies within Saudi and the UAE and other parts has driven a large investment drive, large growth drives to diversify economies and to really lean into digitalisation is to help grow both economies but also influence across the region and sustainability of the regions. And therefore we've seen sort of very large amounts of investment into technology and large amounts of growth within the financial services sector to help fuel that. And where you have change and where you have fast-paced change, you always have issues. And my background, just to introduce that, is I lead our forensic function in the Middle East, and really that focuses on helping clients, predominantly banks and regulators, to help prevent, detect and respond to financial crime issues. And so it's been quite an interesting time over the past few years, and I've been in the Middle East for about 12. One of the things I'll jump into now is what the banking industry is facing as one of its most imminent threats, and it's got the attention of regulators as well within the Middle East, is really around customer push payment fraud. Banks have been really good, and we've seen some demonstrations of apps and other digital platforms this morning. But banks have been very good at putting the walls to the castle up, being good to have dual factor authentication being put in place, biometric countermeasures to access to accounts. But actually it's social engineering fraud, which is an epidemic across the Middle East at the moment. And the Middle East is a unique place for that, based on relatively high GDP per customer, based on high levels of digital engagement within the Middle East, but also a diverse population with differing literacy in financial matters. And this has enabled social engineering fraud to take off at an unprecedented scale, and banks and regulators are struggling to keep up with that, even given the proactive actions that they're taking. The use of generative AI and targeting, specifically using confidential information of customers, is pushing them to be able to influence them to authorize payments from their own accounts. And it's very difficult for banks to be able to stop that, especially when the priority very much across the Middle East and in all digital banking is frictionless transactions. So those frictionless transactions don't always coincide with being able to, in real time, have the systems and processes in place to be able to stop and prevent these types of frauds specifically. And fraudsters are becoming far more adept and effective and enabled by technologies themselves to be able to take advantage. Firstly, the amount of targeting which is personalized towards individuals is absolutely becoming very, very prominent and very credible in terms of the way that they're being able to target. It's also good old-fashioned efficiency. So from outside of the Middle East, you've got actors which are able to target customers and customer bases within the Middle East and really attack with impunity across national borders. So this has resulted in a strong response from regulators and a strong need from banks in order to respond to these threats. And not all of that is digital response. Some of that is customer education programs in conjunction with public-private partnerships with regulators, for example, to help educate the public. But at the same time, that's not always effective. And counter-fraud frameworks or regulatory frameworks have been launched in Saudi Arabia, for example, the counter-fraud framework, and across other Middle East countries in order to try and stop some of these issues and help mature the counter-fraud environment within these regions. Now, a big part of that is real-time transaction monitoring to prevent fraud. And this is something of which financial institutions have struggled within their AML and financial crime compliance programs for some time. The ability to have real-time information, real-time machine learning to be able to adapt has eluded many banks, both globally but also in the Middle East. Now, the push from regulators in some ways can be a little bit unrealistic or at some points not have kept pace with what banks are actually capable of being put into place. And what we're seeing is huge amounts of investment and trials in trying to tune transaction monitoring systems, to implement AI and machine learning tuning models to be able to act in more real time to reduce the number of alerts. Because those of you within financial services will know the amount of transactions and the amount of growth in transactions which is occurring is not enabling sort of normal rules-based systems to be able to prevent anything in real time. Backlogs of transaction monitoring alerts are building up, both for sanctions reasons, for AML causes, and fraud reasons. And often it's far too late to be able to prevent the activity, and it's only good for detecting it after the facts. One of the other areas of which we see through corporate registries being frictionless and being able to open and start new businesses in fast and efficient ways is also that means that people can start up shell companies much more easily as well. And we're seeing large amounts of shell companies being set up to help mask and conceal and layer different financial crime schemes across the Middle East, of which is very difficult to prevent and respond to. So what is the response? And some of this has come from supranational interests. And you'll know, some of you, that the UAE was put on the grey list by the FATF in 2 years ago. And that was a very large wake-up call, both across the region, but especially in the UAE, is that whilst technical compliance was there from a regulatory standpoint on a lot of these matters, effectiveness was not. And those are the lessons of which I'd probably leave you with today is making sure that there's a strong focus on effectiveness within both your institutions and regulatory authorities, because that's ultimately what gets measured. The response from the UAE was incredibly robust. Within 2 years, it had itself, from February of this year, it's been removed from the grey list by the FATF. That's reasonably unprecedented across all countries that have found themselves onto that list in the past. That's come from a number of innovations, but also actions, both in terms of setting up new regulators like the Virtual Assets Regulatory Authority, but also the formation of things like public-private partnerships, of which we spoke about before, and increasing the engagement between regulators and the private sector to be able to share not only knowledge and topologies of what emerging threats and vectors exist, but also to be able to share, in some cases, tactical information which can help root out and stop some of this from happening in the first place. Those are some of the initiatives that are put in place, along with a very enhanced regulatory inspection and enforcement regime, which is occurring across the Middle East. And anytime that there's increased regulation, there's disruption in market. So having seen the amount of that over the past couple of years, we'd expect that pace to continue of regulatory scrutiny. I think the other area is really around sanctions. We've seen anecdotally sort of the interest of US Department of Justice and other OFAC officials in querying. I know the UAE and as well as Uzbekistan sit, unfortunately, on lists of high-risk countries for transshipment, and really the use of dual-use goods has been in focus by some of these other regulators, US regulators and other, and through correspondent banks and others, we're seeing pressure put in place. And that's really starting to, for some banks, needing to put in place enhanced stop and checks when there is trade between different countries, especially, say, within the UAE and Uzbekistan corridor, to go through enhanced compliance procedures which can add cost and slow down business in some cases. So I'll conclude there. I think there's a couple of key takeaways of which sort of we've seen from this change and some of the emerging threats in the Middle East. And I think one of those lessons really needs to be is we tend to invest in financial institutions, tend to invest on the basis of growth. And some of the applications that we've seen over the past, but this morning especially, we can see that the investment is behind what's going to drive revenue. But often we're investing only in compliance and prevention type technologies when there's a business case to be able to reduce costs or there's a regulatory driver. And that's where regulators are really needing to step up and help drive the investment in compliance technologies, which really is the only way, if we're going to drive AI, machine learning into transaction monitoring, of being able to keep pace with the change of which we're going to see. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.